Welcome back. Okay, we left Victoria in a kind of a sticky situation with her husband. And again, things aren't going too smoothly, but let's see how they progress. Let's jump right into this. Victoria sat with Zifra on a grassy floor mat, several feet from the group of men lounging on the ottomans. She and the young girl shared a communal bowl of rice and chicken, as the men were doing. She didn't recognize the seasoning, but then she had never been a food connoisseur. Her taste buds did appreciate the rich flavor, especially since lentil soup with vegetables had been her constant sustenance while ill. With no eating utensils, she concentrated on using pieces of flatbread to scoop up the mixture. A smug pride accompanied her quick mastery of the culinary skill. Rashid glanced in her direction, and she lifted her makeshift spoon in salute. Judging by his raised brow, she wasn't sure he approved of her gesture. No matter, it was still fun. Success in any endeavor was still success. The eating arrangements weren't exactly geared to make a woman feel wanted. Socially snubbed would be more accurate. But she was actually relieved. Being segregated gave her the freedom to amuse herself with a little mockery. For instance, what a difficult task it must be for these men to make babies with women they neither walked with, talked with, nor ate with. She stifled a giggle with her napkin. On the other hand, perhaps afternoon naps were a cultural norm for these men. Remembering her recent experience with the custom, she understood quite well why these men had no problem filling their tents with children. This situation was giving her a one-track mind. She better start acting like the balanced, level-headed woman she was before she did something stupid. She returned to observing the room's occupant. Her husband's 4 guests hadn't acknowledged her presence, and Rashid hadn't made introductions. Being invisible gave her advantages, though. She didn't have to put up with 5 men with inflated egos. Plus, the anonymity gave her ample time to study her husband in his natural setting. She listened to the voices and laughter of his companions, the man she knew as Khalifar and 3 others. They were all 10 or 20 years older than Rashid, but their genuine affection and respect for him was easily discernible. They didn't defer to him because he was a prince, but paid him a higher tribute. They accepted him as one of their own. This man who claimed her without hesitation or guilt was a walking puzzle. Arrogant beyond belief, yet considerate. Dictatorial, but principled. He was a stranger to her, and yet they were now connected on a level she had neither sought nor understood. She charted the contours of his handsome face, his dusky skin a perfect canvas for the midnight brilliance of his eyes. She followed the changing shape of his lips as they moved in easy conversation, lips both savage and gentle. Her senses slipped into harmony with his every move, transporting her heart to the edge of a dangerous precipice. She wanted to keep him forever. She gasped as a hidden desire congealed into a clear and present longing. The gasp caused her to choke on the chicken now stuck in her throat. Like an idiot, she'd drawn all eyes in the room toward her. Discreetly, she took a sip of water, which helped soothe the convulsions in her throat. She didn't look up, knowing her thoughts were in her eyes for all to read. Thankfully, the man resumed their conversation. This time, when she raised her eyes to study him, she forced her errant emotions into line. She could not afford to let herself need anybody, especially this man. He exercised too much power already. If she had not realized this before, she did now. Her power showed its strength not in forcing her, but in making her want to give him what he wanted. Her silent yielding this afternoon brought that reality sharply to surface. Sure, he wanted her, maybe even entertained some affection for her, but she was an acquisition, an ornament he valued, nothing more. She could never fully share his life, never stand by his side, never work shoulder to shoulder with him, and never receive as much as she would have to give. The faces of her 4 beautiful children tugged at her heart. Rashid would never accept 4 children who were not his, nor in reality hers. Taking a chance on trusting him would be putting her children at risk, something she would never do. Victoria heard her name and realized Rashid was speaking to her. Looking around, she was amazed to find the room empty of its guests. She must have been deeply engrossed in her thoughts to miss their departure. Are you well? You were choking earlier, and just now you were very distracted. Yes, I'm fine. Just tired, I think. I'm not in the habit of eating so late. It must be after 11. Go to bed. I'll see the lamps are extinguished. A suggestion she was eager to take, but there was only one sleeping area. Where are you going to sleep? In my bed. But I'm in your bed, as you should be. But, do not cause yourself stress. When it is necessary, I can be a patient man. You will come to me in time. However, if I must wait, I do not intend to forego all pleasure. A man is entitled to hold his wife while she sleeps. I don't think. Do not pick this battle to fight, Victoria. You will not win. Now please do as I ask. You are still weak from your illness and need your rest. Victoria changed for bed in record time, grateful for the sleeping shift Zifra supplied her. Reaching her calf and having a neckline her prudish grandmother would have approved of, the sleeping attire made her less nervous about sharing his bed. She no longer feared he would force her into a sexual relationship she didn't want. As he had once said, I never lie to a woman. So far he'd proven his word to be sufficient. Rashid entered and dropped his robe across the stool, then disappeared into the bath. Victoria took the opportunity to scoot to the far edge of the bed, which was difficult seeing that there were no real edges. Pulling the covers up, she waited. He was quick to return. Darkness enveloped her as he extinguished the last lamp, adding a deeper layer of intimacy. Her heartbeat skyrocketed as the bed moved under his weight. A warm, strong hand slid around her waist. With a suggestive tug, he communicated his expectation. Taking his earlier advice, she conceded the battle and scooted backward until her body met his. Not satisfied with her choice of contact, he drew her closer until they were tightly spooned together. Why, at this late stage in her life, did she finally find the cocooning safety she craved since her mother's death? Why did his cultural point of view drive her crazy while his arms made her a willing captive? Reason told her to slay the conqueror and free the princess, allowing her to return to the sanity of her steel and concrete world. Her heart, however, wanted to stay a prisoner, locked away forever in this man's world. Victoria sighed with longing and denial. She couldn't reach for a fantasy that held no future for her children. Rashid, can I ask you something? You may ask whatever you wish. How do you feel about children? Are we talking about our children or children as a whole? Well, let's just say we decided to give this relationship a trial run. How would you think about children then? There is no trial here, Victoria. Do you not, in fact, lie in my embrace? Do you not shelter under my tent, sleep in my bed? You only play games in your mind to allow yourself to think all this is fantasy instead of truth. Okay. Just answer the question. When you come to me, I will see that you are not with child too quickly. You need time to come to know your new home and husband. As for me, I do not wish to share you with the demanding task of motherhood just yet. I expect we will have many children in the future. But for now, we need only concern ourselves with uniting the two of us. Does this satisfy your need for an answer? Yes. Let your mind empty, my wife. Think of the indigo sky above with its multitude of starry lights, each shining in watchful care over you. Think of my body as a shield for yours, my arms as they protect and shelter. Know on this night, the most valued treasure the desert holds in its warm embrace is you. Her mind reeled with the poetry of his words. He was addicting. A silent tear slid down her cheek and then another. She could have Rashid in every fantasy he embodied, but that fantasy did not include her children. Having dealt in facts her whole life, she knew they didn't lie. Facts dictated action. She was on an ocean with no safe harbors. She needed to return to stable ground as quickly as she could before her will to do so vanished. Victoria loved to stroll from tent to tent, exchanging greetings with the women and playing hide and seek with the children were highlights of her last 5 days. She'd asked Rashid to interpret the game's rules to the children, and to her amazement, he'd done so with enthusiasm, even joining in on occasion. She couldn't believe how easily she'd fit into a primitive and nomadic way of life. The women here never stressed over organizing their priorities or stayed awake at night planning how best to stay one step ahead of every male colleague in their father's firm. They were contented women, focused on their family role. Despite their less than empowered lifestyle, they were happy. Their husbands appeared distant and remote on the surface, but in reality, they were very aware of their family's needs and desires. An affectionate glance or smile between couples when they thought no one observed was common. In a male-dominated and restrictive culture, women here had foregone independence for the protection of a man's strength and his ability to provide for them and their children. It wasn't perfect, but neither was the overrated freedom which had so complicated her life. Stopping to enjoy her favorite spot by the oasis pool, she watched the breeze-driven ripples roll across the blue-green water. So beautiful, but not as perfect as the night before, when the moon had ridden high in the night sky. Its reflection on the glassy surface of the water appeared so clear. If she had been able to walk on water, she would have stood on the moon itself. No spot on earth could be more magical or lend itself more readily to spinning fantasies. Regret squeezed her heart. Her children would love this place. The sun, the sand, the adventure. How she wished they were here playing with these tawny-skinned children in innocent disregard for the world's problems and prejudices. She could almost hear Aaron's delighted laughter at being included among the small boys of the camp who swam and played with Rashid in the waning evening light. And wouldn't her princesses giggle in delight to be among the little girls allowed to brush Ali? How patient Rashid had been, teasing and encouraging the little girls to approach the fearsome black animal. He would make a wonderful father. She lay in his embrace each night, savoring every nuance of his being. his earthy smell, his possessive touch. The masculine body next to hers no longer assaulted her invisible barriers. Now she was the one who moved willingly into his waiting embrace and eagerly responded to his exploring kisses. Secretly, she was the one who silently screamed in denial each time he set limits on his desire. Day by day, she carefully inscribed on her heart every expression and promise in his beautiful eyes and heart-stopping smile. Deliberately, she stored up a lifetime of memories, knowing there was no hope of blending their two worlds. The ocean of differences between them was too wide and uncharted. A popping noise, similar to gunfire, put an end to her troubling thoughts. Cautiously, she followed the sound around the pool and over the top of the dune behind it. Reaching its summit, she knelt and peered at the scene below. 25 or 30 men formed a circle around 4 combatants. The sound she'd heard was the crack of Rashid's whip. He stood alone in the circle's center. 3 men armed with curved swords in one hand and daggers in the other stalked him from 3 sides. Alarmed, she eased over the hill and made her way down the other side. She crossed the few yards to the outer edge of the ring of men encircling the fighters. Recognizing her, they parted their ranks, giving her access to the front. The shouting increased in decibels as the crowd became more excited. She thought they might be engaged in a sport of some kind until, to her horror, one of the men cut into Rashid's chest, drawing a line of blood across his shirt. Bile rose in her throat. She covered her mouth with her hand and swallowed repeatedly to keep from vomiting. What was going on? Why did someone not help him? A wave of terror rolled up her throat like bile. What if this was a mutiny or rebellion or whatever you call such a thing in the middle of a sanity-forsaken desert? That would explain why no one was attempting to defend him. She must do something. She couldn't stand here and watch him murdered in front of her eyes. Scanning the crowd for something she could use as a weapon, she spotted a man a few feet to her left with a holstered pistol strapped to his waist. His fisted hands were raised in the air as he shouted encouragement at the contenders. She inched toward him and carefully slipped the gun from his holster. For a split second, she weighed the consequences of her next move, then pushed them aside and charged into the circle of conflict toward Rashid. Approaching one attacker from the rear, she lowered her shoulder and rammed into his back with all her might, knocking him to the ground. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, but she was still on her feet. Jerking the gun over her head, she pulled the trigger and fired one round, then another. Everything stopped. Like a movie reel after a film break, the action froze in time. Stepping away from the prone man, she measured the distance to Rashid. Behind him, she saw another of his attackers start to move toward him. She leveled the pistol and shot. The man stopped dead still and stared incredulously at the bullet hole in the sand just inches from his feet. "Get back, all of you!" She had gained their attention. They might not understand her words, but they understood her intent. Not one of them moved. Victoria knew no group of men would ever be more astonished than those who watched her now. She was counting on their astonishment to give Rashid some kind of advantage. Turning her pleading eyes on him, she shouted, "Come on, you need to get out of here." He lowered his whip, but he didn't move. "Victoria, put the gun down. There is no danger here." "No, they will kill you," she said, her voice high-pitched with hysteria. She glanced back at the first assailant and found him on his feet again, and easing his way toward her. She whirled on him and lifted the pistol. The crack of an extended whip reverberated through the dunes. At the same moment, the extended coil wrapped around the barrel of her gun. The pistol flew from her hands into the air, falling several yards out of her reach. Confused and terrified, she ran toward Rashid and vaulted into his arms. She threw off his head covering and entangled her fingers in his hair, using the advantage to pull his mouth to hers. If they were going to die, she wanted to die in his arms. For the barest of seconds, he remained motionless. Then he wrapped her in a bone-crushing embrace. Too soon, he parted his lips from hers, and dug his hands into her hair, pushing her face into his chest. His racing heart pounded loud and strong. He murmured something over and over as if reciting a prayer. Since he spoke in his own language, she had no idea what he said. Realizing she could be exposing him to more danger, she released her hold on his shoulders and pushed away from him. He allowed the separation. The appalling sight of his blood, now wet and sticky on her palm, forced a strangled cry from her lips. Reeling from the atrocity, she melted at his feet for the second time. The throbbing in her head kept up an agonizing tempo. Victoria listened to my voice. I am safe. You are safe. Please ease your mind and relax. Something cool settled across her forehead. My head hurts, she complained, half coherent. You need to open your eyes and take these tablets. They will ease your headache. You are suffering from too much sun and a great deal too much excitement. She bolted upright, sending arrows of pain through her temples. They were trying to kill you. No. It was merely a training exercise. But you were bleeding. Nothing serious. Merely a miscalculation on my part. The wound will heal quickly. Are you telling me I made a complete fool of myself for nothing? You have never been a fool, and I have decided you may rescue me whenever you wish. This can't be real. Take these tablets to ease the pain, then we'll talk. She willingly complied and let him ease her back down on the pillow. Boy, I must have broken every rule in your book and started another one. Tell me I didn't kiss you in front of all those men. He placed the water glass on a side table and sat beside her on the bed before answering her plea. A teasing grin gave her some warning of his smug satisfaction. I would allow myself to be tortured to death before I would deny the evidence of my wife's great affection. Victoria groaned and covered her face with her hands. 2.5 weeks with this man and she'd become a deranged, wild woman. I'm sure your people will be glad to see the last of me. On the contrary, my people seem to think I have been most wise in my choice of a wife. They have named you Princess of Fire. These men respect courage, whether they find this in a man or a woman. You, my wife, are a woman of great courage. Picking up her hand, Rashid placed a kiss in her palm and on the throbbing pulse at her wrist. His eyes glowed with a new kind of confidence. He fingered the golden bells on the bracelet encircling her wrist. In ancient times, the Sultan's favorite was the only one who could wear this bracelet. The bracelet symbolized the great pleasure he found in her. Night and day, he could hear the musical sound and know she was near. Why give it to me then? You hardly know me. I have always known you, Victoria. Every man knows when he has found the one woman who must belong to him alone. It is a thing not easily explained, but true. Today you gave me a gift of inestimable value. His words spun her heart like a top. Much more, and she would give him anything he asked. Better to change the mood, lighten the conversation. Under the circumstances, I think I can be forgiven for getting a little crazy. I'm not brave, but I'm not a coward either. I do the same for a mugging victim in New York, so don't make too much out of it. You do not like to admit you care for me. Whatever my feelings, nothing will change the facts. This relationship cannot work. I am too pleased with you at the moment to take exception to your stubborn words. Besides, I have a surprise for you. The gleam in his eyes tantalized and teased her. What do you mean? Tonight is our last night in this place. We leave tomorrow for the palace. I have pressing matters which need my attention. As is customary, on my last night I share a meal with the sheiks and their sons. Tonight, you have been given the privilege of being an invited guest. Are any of the other women going to be present? I believe the sheiks are allowing their wives to attend in deference to you. Never underestimate the power of a woman with a gun, she sniffed haughtily. The mighty men of the desert are actually lowering themselves to eat with a mere female. Rashid raised a disapproving eyebrow. I expect you to conduct yourself properly. Would I dare do otherwise, my lord? She should take pity on him. If he gritted his teeth any harder, he would crack one. Practicing a measure of diplomacy, she added a little reassurance for the sake of peace. Don't worry. I promise not to embarrass you. Victoria dressed and carefully positioned her head covering, leaving only a tiny bit of blonde hair exposed on her forehead. She paced the communal area of the tent while she waited on Rashid. Whoever said women were slow dressers hadn't waited on a desert prince. When he finally parted the drapes, she was overwhelmed with the majesty of his appearance. He was mind-numbingly gorgeous as he stood like a conqueror of worlds, her world at least. His headpiece, trimmed in black and gold braiding, stamped him as exotic and mysterious. A red silk sash wrapped his waist. The striking color created a powerful contrast against the black of his pants and shirt and the white of his robe. Regal was the word which came to mind, princely. She was definitely going to be on the arm, or rather 3 feet behind, the best-looking man at the banquet. Are you ready, Victoria? She cocked her head and studied him for a moment, still immersed in the sensual magnetism he radiated like heat. Do you like what you see? Confidence smoldered in his knowing eyes. I was just thinking how much you look like a character in a Hollywood movie. Is that a compliment or an insult? At the risk of swelling your inflated ego, let's just say I'd pay the admission fee. His eyes moved freely up and down her body. The suggestive grin painted on his incredible mouth curled her toes. Why pay for what you already own? And I am most eager to give. Victoria's mouth went dry. With a few words, he could reduce her to a quivering mass of nerve endings, all of which wanted to be plastered to him. She needed to change the subject. I wish I could match your elegance. These robes don't offer us poor females much of an opportunity for fashion. Your kind of beauty does not need to preen itself in fashion or embellishments. The sun kisses your hair. The starry heavens shine in your eyes, and your body sings at the touch of my hand. Nothing could make you more beautiful. This man was dangerous. His tongue should be labeled as a lethal weapon. How was a woman supposed to cope with a man who could disarm her with only 3 sentences? With half a smile, she thanked him for the compliment. To remind you of how much you please me will always be my privilege. I would tell you more, but we are expected, and I do not wish to insult our host. She exited the tent behind Rashid and followed in his wake. With each step, she measured her disintegrating resolve. Not a pleasant thought process, since it forced her to put things in their proper perspective. This place, this man, could be nothing more than an exotic detour on her way back to where she belonged. As much as Rashid touched her heart, and she was willing to admit he did, those things couldn't outweigh her good sense. Never once had he acknowledged her achievements or personal goals. The fact she had important responsibilities to complete had never crossed his mind. His cultured heritage and power had molded his perspective so thoroughly that, aside from her physical appeal, he simply couldn't see her. A disturbance stopped Rashid's progress and her worrisome thoughts. A small group gathered before the entrance to one of the tents. Some individuals murmured and seemed at odds with one another. She stepped from behind and slightly to the side of Rashid to see what was happening. A lone man stood at the tent's entrance with his arms tightly folded across his chest. In the evening's dim light, she could just make out the look of anger and contempt hardening his features. Stiff-necked and apparently unrelenting, he was doing a good job of ignoring the sobbing woman at his feet. The murmuring sank to silence, and only the woman's deep sobs shattered the peaceful night. The painful sound rent Victoria's heart. Surely the man had not abused this fragile woman. The possibility impelled Victoria to step forward. A barrier slashed across her path. Rashid's outstretched arm lay against her breasts, stopping her forward movement. He pushed just enough to make her back up. Victoria opened her mouth to tell him what he could do with a broken arm when a collective gasp splintered the air. The woman had leaned forward and was resting her forehead on the man's booted foot. She had no idea what was taking place. One thing for sure, though, the pitiful drama in the sand was not to her liking. Why did Rashid not do something? Finally, after what seemed an agonizing length of time, the man uttered a short command, then abruptly turned and entered his tent. The change in the woman's demeanor was instant and startling. She rose to her feet, smiled at someone in the crowd, and then entered the tent behind the disagreeable jerk. Rashid briefly touched her arm and indicated by the tilt of his head he was moving on. Some distance from the troubling scene, he stopped in a secluded area and turned to face her. You will not enjoy the evening while your mind ponders what you have just witnessed. Ask the questions I know are on your mind. What was that all about? I haven't seen anything like that before. When a wife commits a serious offense against her husband, an offense resulting in his rejection of her, she has one of two choices. She can take her case before the tribal elders, or she can humble herself and offer public contrition as you have just witnessed. Such an action restores her husband's honor and is a plea for his forgiveness. If he tells her to rise, she is forgiven, and her position as his wife is restored. Well, What happens if he doesn't ask her to rise? Then his dismissal of her is final. She is divorced. It is an ancient custom which is still legally binding. Then, though, they're going to be okay, right? I mean, he did forgive her, right? Yes. Do men ever, do they ever publicly ask for forgiveness? No. Doesn't such a fact seem a little out of balance and justice to you? I have never considered it a question of balance or justice, simply an ancient way that has worked for thousands of years. I see no need to examine what is not broken. No, I guess you wouldn't. You're not the one on your knees. I did not bring this up as a matter of debate, Victoria. I simply did not want you troubling your mind for the rest of the evening. Now let's proceed. Rashid turned around and continued forward, cutting off the dialogue he had opened. She glared at his rigid back and made herself a promise. One day, she would have the last word. In addition, if words could kill, she would make sure she had a few weapons of mass destruction in her verbal arsenal. Despite the evening's disastrous beginning, Victoria did indeed enjoy her social outing. Like the other wives, she sat a little behind and to the left of her husband, who introduced her to the assemblage as a whole and acted as her interpreter. One man introduced himself as the one whose feet she had fired a bullet between. By the heat moving up her face, she knew she must be blushing as she offered her apologies. The man assured her he would count it an honor to lose both his feet for such a courageous defender of the kingdom and its prince. That sounded like a firm endorsement to her and went a long way in salvaging her pride. The inky black midnight sky covered the camp as they left the diner gathering. A temperate breeze rustled through the palm fronds along their path. Rashid remained silent as he took the lead, negotiating the darkness and choosing the trail leading toward their favorite spot by the moon pool. The secluded niche lay hidden by curtains of oleanders and cypress trees over which the night shadows hung like draperies. He removed his robe and head covering, spreading the robe on the warm sand. Victoria's heart somersaulted as strong hands molded her cheeks and then slid under the sides of her head covering, slipping the cloth from her head and freeing a mass of honey blonde hair. Taking the tip of one long strand, he brushed the silken ends across her lips, and then very slowly he slid its softness across his own. Her stomach clenched. He let the strand slip through his fingers and reached for her hand. Lifting her fingers to his mouth, he brushed them over his full, warm lips. Parting them slightly, he moistened her fingertips with his warm tongue. Her sense of touch increased 100 times, making her fingers central receptors. She couldn't drag her eyes from his. He smiled, and she knew he watched her soul shatter when he placed her damp fingers across her own lips. Your eyes are as revealing as the blue sky they resemble. They burn and blaze with desire, and then at your bidding they cool, only to blaze again at my touch. Victoria could no longer hold his gaze. The desire he spoke of not only burned in her eyes, it threatened her very existence. She was lost and afraid. Dropping her gaze to the ground, she sought to hide her floundering emotions. Rashid slid his hand around her throat and lifted her chin. Never hide from me. Her eyes followed a path up the straining muscles of his throat, over the jutting hardness of his chin, past the flaming temptation of his mouth, to the savage passion in his eyes. You are mine in every way but one. Come to me willingly. End this torment. She wanted to step into the promise of his arms, to free the woman beating at her heart. Too many years, chained to playing a role, being anything but herself, held her back. Her whole life teetered on a foundation no stronger than the grains of sand under her feet. This man would bring her world down, and in the end, leave her with nothing. He wanted her, but he didn't love her. Remove your robe. What? Your reluctance is evident. While I do not like the fact that you deny us both, I have given you my word. I will wait for your willing response. The irritation in his words couldn't be masked. He was a man not used to waiting, especially for a woman's consent. Even though you deny me the pleasure of your body, I claim the right to sit and enjoy the night with my wife. Remove your robe. She took off her robe, and he spread it on the ground beside his. Gently, he drew her down to the makeshift pallet. Positioning himself behind her, he drew her back between his spread legs to rest against his chest. Wrapping her in his arms did not seem to satisfy his need to touch. His legs lifted and his strong thighs tightened against her hips. This is a magic place. Do you not agree? His sultry voice stirred against her hair. With his hands moving deliberately up and down her arms, as if mesmerizing and memorizing their pattern, it was impossible to conceive that any man or place could be more enchanted. Yes, this is a wonderful place. A touch of fairy dust come to life. Did you grow up here? Beginning at the age of 6, I was sent here to live with these tribes for 3 months each year. My father believed a man of privilege could never understand a people whose mind and heart he did not know. It was difficult at first, but I soon came to love these people in the desert life. What about your family, your parents, brothers and sisters? My mother is French, and after the death of my father, she returned to Paris, where she still lives today. I was 15 at that time. As the new ruler of Ahalamin, I chose to stay and assume the responsibilities left to me. That must have been hard. I suppose. Not being the firstborn son, I was not groomed for leadership. My older brother, Raziz, died in the same explosion which killed my father. He was 21 and would have made a great leader. Explosion? A malfunction in the electrical system of my father's plane. I lost my mother when I was 12. She relaxed more heavily against his chest. Although I had my father, I was still lonely. Things must have been worse for you with no family around. It would have been if not for Khalifar. By birth, he is my cousin. He was trained by my father to be first regent for my brother. 10 years older than I, he has been my family, counselor, and jailer at times. I was not always as reasonable as I am now. Hard to believe, Victoria smiled to herself. Why have you not married before now? I can't believe there are not endless numbers of women attracted to your, reasonableness. There have been women in my life, but none whose fears or rejection I would tolerate. Certainly none with whom I would spend my nights with only conversation between us. Rashid's fingers entwined with hers. Never has there been a woman with whom I would sit in the sand. What do you mean? A man needs a woman who is elemental to him. Victoria's heart grasped for his meaning. In what way do you see me as elemental? A man needs air to breathe, Victoria, his heart to beat, and one woman who is more basic to his life than either of those two. Like a tsunami, his words first sucked away every tenuous thread of resistance. Then wave after wave of unbearable longing washed over her, breaking through a barrier she could no longer defend. She wanted this night, wanted the memory of this man to treasure for all the years she would be without him. Rashid? Yes. I want... She didn't know how to ask for what she wanted. Vulnerable beyond bearing, she struggled to get the words past her lips. I want... Rashid shifted her until she knelt between his legs, facing him. Framing her face with his hands, he looked searchingly into her eyes. She didn't hide this time, didn't blink. She let him read what she couldn't voice. I want everything, Victoria. All of you. If you say yes, I will make you mine in every way. No more denial of what is between us. No more resistance. Is this what you want? Unable any longer to deny the truth, she nodded her acceptance. To this moment, to this man, she wanted to give everything, and she wanted to take. She wanted everything he offered, if only for one night. He stood and drew her to her feet. Tell me, what do you want? I want you to take me. Before she could finish, Rashid yanked up his robe and wrapped it around her, leaving hers in the sand. Then, sweeping her into his arms, he strode single-mindedly toward his tent. She'd unleashed a storm. The evidence was in his neglect to cover her completely. She knew the blonde curls flowing over his arm as he carried her past two night guards never entered his passion-filled mind. She buried her face in his shoulder and trembled. The force of his desire thrilled her and put a lacy edge of fearful anticipation on her desperate need of him. She sat close to the rim of the bed. Her fisted, trembling hands lay in her lap. The early morning light, slipping through the ventilation space at the top of the tent, bathed her in crimson and violet hues. The same shafts of light streaked across the bed and wantonly caressed the bare expanse of Rashid's shoulders and back. He lay facing her on his stomach. His head rested on an arm, which doubled for the pillow he'd swept from the bed. A sweet memory softened her worried brow. Concerning her nap-time maneuvers, he'd called her a traveler. If that were true, then he was an aggressive colonizer, claiming every inch of the bed for himself. The covers he'd pulled over them earlier still covered him to the waist. She sensed the heat creeping up her neck and face as she thought about his complete lack of inhibitions in the night and his patience in coaching her into a realm of sensual delight so beautiful, its memory forced tears to her eyes. She thought herself a sophisticated woman, knowledgeable in romance, love, and sex. After all, she'd grown up in New York City, where the sex sells advertising theory displayed on every taxi, bus, building, billboard, and bench removed any young girl's naivety. As she looked at the mouth-watering male form sprawled in front of her, she knew none of those concepts even came close to the mindless ecstasy he had given her. Rashid stirred, and she held her breath. She didn't want to be caught ogling him. He was already much too convinced of his ability to turn her on at will, a fact he had proven more than once in the hours before dawn. His searching hand slid across the sheet in her direction, and his fingers curled around her ankle. She flinched at the sound of his sleepy voice. You are cold. Come here and let me warm you. Victoria was cold. The numbing decision she'd made in the early dawn hours chilled her to the core. She would never regret the night shared with this man, but she needed to end this fairy tale. She desperately missed her children and the sanity of her 60-hour-a-week job. She was a working woman with responsibilities, not a princess. Women in the real world didn't live happily ever after with the prince. I think we should talk, she said firmly. Rashid slowly turned to his back, his smoky eyes focusing on her. What is wrong? Why are you dressed so early? You said we were leaving here today. Yes, but not for a few more hours. Rashid, I don't know how to say this except straightforwardly. Last night was beautiful beyond anything I could have imagined. But this place, us, it's all a fantasy. She knew she had his attention when he rose up on one elbow, and the drowsiness in his eyes gave way to piercing concentration. A bride's first days with her husband should be beautiful. There's no fantasy here, Victoria. Our joining was very real. You are the wife of my body as well as my soul. But I shouldn't be. I have my own life. Rashid moved like lightning, lifting and sliding her across his thighs until she sat in the middle of his lap. What is this nonsense? She pushed at his chest. I want to go home. I have a life of my own. I have people I care about. You can't just take over a person's life because you want them. You have no right. Right? You are my wife. That gives me the right. A right you sealed yourself in my arms last night. I will hear no more of this. She struggled in earnest as those same arms tightened, lifting her to the raw possession of his mouth. She fought both herself and him. He didn't relent. In anger and despair, she tried every way to free herself from his arms, but nothing weakened his strength. He let her expend her energy and then laid her down. He enticed her back into his sensual world with soul-shattering gentleness. With each touch, she offered him more, her inflamed desire for completion matching his. He had told her this was inevitable, her need of him, and with each caress he proved his words true. Open your eyes, Victoria. She shuddered, but did as he asked. His expression revealed a man torn between passion and anger. He allowed her to take the full weight of his massive body, not caring if he crushed the breath from her. Your body lifts itself to mine, You want me more than you want your next breath. This is where you belong. This is where you will stay. Before another hour passes, you will beg me never to release you. This I swear. Before she could speak, he claimed her mouth with raging fervor. She'd wanted to know how far he'd let her go, and now she knew. The gentle, sensual lover of the early hours was gone. In his place was a man whose uncensored passion branded her as his. Somewhere in the middle of the tempest, she fulfilled his oath.